Barka, I'm trying to figure out whether you have the bigger crowd or did Karan Johar have the bigger crowd.
I think they're all here for you, Shobha.
Yes. We know that yesterday's session with Karan has led to a bit of a controversy, not a bit of, quite a controversy. I hope today we can generate an even bigger one, because it's important for people to speak up and feel confident that they can do so and not be stamped all over, whether it's on social media platforms, public opinion, and whoever it may be today who decides what's palatable and what isn't.
Well, Shobha, I think in your company, one would expect no less than to be absolutely unfettered, blunt, and not give a toss about what other people have to say, whether online or offline.
Big round of applause for Barka and a fabulous book. I read it in one go.
Thank you.
And it raises a lot of very important social, cultural, and gender issues. So let me start with the gender part of it first. Just as I was coming for this session, I met another senior journalist I respect very much. And she's just gotten out of a magazine journalism. She was with a magazine for a long time. And the reason she quit Barka is because she felt there was tremendous amount of inequality in terms of what the ladies were getting paid, the women working, they're doing exactly the same job as the people who are at the next desk, who are paying themselves sometimes 3 times what their colleagues.
Yeah.
Have you experienced that yourself in media and as a crack professional? Do you think you're not given the same opportunities sometimes, not the same paycheck, not the same respect?
It's very interesting because, you know, Shobha, all my life, and you've known me a while, I've never believed in playing victim. And nobody who knows me, everybody knows I'm a forceful Punjabi by personality. And I never use gender as a shield to hide behind. That said, as I grow older, I'm now 44, I find I'm a lot less defensive about the inequities that we do have to face as women, and let's not pretend that we don't. One of the things I've discovered is that no matter how confident one may be, women in general have a problem talking about money. Even when we want to be paid more, we're kind of sheepish, we're kind of half embarrassed. How many women here relate to what I'm saying? Please raise your hand. Please raise your hand if you relate to what I'm saying. And see, there you have it. It's I don't know what it is. It's some sort of socialization. And I do feel that in many ways the film industry has been braver than the rest of us, because at least you have the Kanganas and the Anushkas saying, where's the pay parity? Whereas we're kind of, okay, you know, we're proud of our work and we're not doing it for the money. Yes, we're not doing it for the money, but we've got to give up this squeamishness about saying that we're worth just as much as the men, so we should be paid just as much on the basis of our talent. However, I will say one thing to the latter part of your question. You know, I do feel that a woman in the public eye, this is as true for you as it is for me. It's even truer for you because in so many ways you're much spunkier and much braver than I am. We get scrutinized in language in ways that men never do. Let me give you an example. Do you know that Wikipedia says that I have 3 husbands? I don't even have one. Then they say they're all either Kashmiri or Muslim. The underlined bit is Muslim. Why do they say this? Because they're trying to explain my ideology and my politics. Have you ever heard a male professional deconstructed in this way? Have you ever heard a male journalist whose personal life is fictionalized? Whether it's fictional or real is not the point. Why are women spoken of in the filthiest language that is never used for men?
Well, we've just experienced that with Sunny Leone.
Yes.
And the way she was humiliated on television.
But didn't she hold her own?
She held her own, and so good for her.
She was fabulous.
How many women can do that?
She was fabulous.
She was very spunky, and also she was extremely poised. And she didn't lose her dignity for a minute. And the man did.
He had
every time he uttered, you know, any sentence which was designed to humiliate her, he in fact humiliated himself.
But wasn't it telling? The questions that he asked Sunny Leone are the kind of things that people say in drawing rooms about women. And say it all the time. They're the kind of comments that people leave online. She just had the gumption to take them on head on, and more power to her.
Yes, more power to her, more power to you.
Thank you.
Because in the book you have also dealt with a part of your life which most women would shy away from sharing with the world. You've talked about sexual abuse when you were a young girl. And I noticed in the early narratives when people were talking to you, when they were interviewing you for television and for press, most of the questions had to do with the sexual aspect of that abuse, almost in a kind of a voyeuristic way.
Yes.
So these are things that I don't think they would ask. They do ask of only public figures who happen to be women. There is a vicarious thrill in knowing, oh my God, you were sexually abused. So what exactly happened? What exactly was done to you? Do you want? I mean, that's horrible. You've dealt with it wonderfully. But why did you include that in this particular book? Which of course it delves into gender issues, but it's more or less a compendium of your columns, which is political writing. I know that you've used it to also draw attention to the fact that even someone like yourself, no woman is generally spared, which is what you've said, that no woman that you know has been spared of sexual harassment at some point or the other in her life. So why did you include that particular chapter, and why do you think people keep asking only about that?
So it's a great question, because it was really a difficult decision for me to decide whether to deal with my personal experiences as a child with sexual abuse, and as a young adult with actually violence in a personal relationship. And my first instinct was to not put it in there, because it's not a memoir, it's not an autobiography, it's my take on India. It's a very serious book of my journalistic experiences of India. But then my first chapter is called The Place of Women. And of course, my observations as a journalist have also related to our changing conversation around gender. And then I said, okay, how can I write about other women I've met who have been sexually abused, who have experienced violence, without putting my own experience in? And I just felt like a complete hypocrite when the narrative was going in that direction, when I was yet again not going to talk about these things that had happened to me. And I think I just feel that as women, so there were two reasons for putting it in. One, to remain honest, that if we're talking about the fact that the conspiracy of silence must break around sexual violence and abuse, then I have to be part of breaking that silence. And two, because while people keep asking me about it, Shobha, at least I can sit here in front of these thousands of people and talk about it. I know women where violence and abuse has been within their circle of trust, it's been in their bedroom, it's been in their marriages, it's been by uncles, by brothers, by cousins, and we can't talk about it because it's so close to the bone. And I just felt that if I talk about it, maybe it's one bit in that larger changing conversation around gender. Maybe it'll get easier for other women to talk about it as well. Why do people keep asking me about it? You know, somebody said this to me. Somebody said, you know, you're going to put this in, they're going to forget the rest of the book, and they're going to keep asking you about it, so don't do it.
Yes.
And I said, well, I have to do it because it's dishonest. And I have to be able to sit here in a public forum like this and talk about sexual abuse so that other women can too.
To go straight into the political aspects of your book, you've talked about how you felt. Your chapter on Rahul Gandhi is absolutely fantastic. I think it's also very fair, it's very balanced. But there's a line which I loved, which says, according to you, Rahul Gandhi was almost like someone who had gate crashed the revolution.
I said he was like the Raja who
crashed the revolution. So can you give us a backgrounder to that, because there's a lovely story that precedes it.
Okay, so basically in 2014, Rahul's sister Priyanka gave me a call, and she said, you know, I finally convinced my brother to start doing interviews, and we would like to start with you, and then Arnab and Rajdeep will also come on board. And I said, okay. And she said, but we want to have a chat, so can you come and meet him? Now, Rahul Gandhi he meets journalists sometimes, but not too often. He's really reclusive, and he really belongs to some yesteryear brand of politics, you know, where you think, okay, you don't have to know journalists, you don't have to talk to them. So I went, and in the course of this conversation, we got into a reasonable argument. Even when there were no cameras, this was just a chat, and he kept saying that, you know, I believe in the empowerment and opening doors for empowerment of everybody in politics, and I'm going to democratize the Congress party. So I said to him that, Rahul, you represent inherited political power, and therefore you represent the opposite of empowerment, you represent entitlement. And he just paused and he said, well, do you agree? Do you guys agree? Yeah, so he said to me, and I put this in the book, that, you know, maybe you're right, but if my mother and I were to leave the party and make that space for other people, the party would just break. And I found the statement so extraordinarily arrogant, then I thought maybe it is the truth about the Congress and that's why it is in the situation that it is in. Because while other politicians from Modi to Kejriwal to Nitish Kumar are self-made, the Congress is still stuck in the trap of inherited power. And you know, and that's why I said that while everybody else was kind of moving on, he is like the Raja who gate crashed the revolution. Eventually, of course, to cut a long story short, that interview went to Arnab. I personally think Arnab was pretty mild-mannered by Arnab standards. But Rahul kind of messed that one up. And then he never did an interview again.
You end the book, pretty much was the end of the book, where with the Dadri, it was one of the most tragic events in recent memory and contemporary history. And you've talked about beef politics.
Yes.
So my question to you is, do you think, given the background, given Dadri, given how beef politics has been handled or mishandled, that Narendra Modi may lose the next elections based on the beef politics alone and what went wrong in India during a very, very sensitive period? Was it like an inflection point?
It was an inflection. I believe Dadri was an inflection point. I believe that the suicide of a young student in Hyderabad is another inflection point. So let's not mince words here. Sometimes in the life of a country, there are incidents that become larger than themselves. They become symbols of a larger conversation.
Like
Nirbhaya, Dadri, now Hyderabad are those conversations. I don't know that Modi would necessarily lose the next election because we're still waiting for alternatives to emerge that are able to challenge him.
And that's not Rahul Gandhi, clearly.
I don't think that's Rahul Gandhi. I don't think that's... one other line I have about Rahul Gandhi is that Arvind Kejriwal is what Rahul Gandhi wanted to be but didn't have the guts to be. So you know, I do think Arvind Kejriwal represents an idea. And I think Rahul Gandhi would have wanted to occupy that space, but the conundrum of being a dynast completely stops him from ever being that role. But you know, Shobha, I remember you said on Twitter that, you know, I'm something about beef, eating beef, and you said, come and get me.
Come and murder me.
Come and murder me.
I've just eaten beef.
I've just eaten beef, come and murder me. And that's courage. And you know what I think we're really missing in India is that kind of courage. And what's disappointing to me, and the reason our conversation around tolerance is so corrupted, is there isn't a genuinely liberal politician, because even while the Congress and other parties were condemning what happened in Dadri, where is the liberal politician who will stand up and say that it is your right to eat whatever meat you want to if you choose to? There is such double speak around this that you're criticizing what happened in Dadri, but you're not standing up for individual liberty. No opposition party has stood up for that either. And my view on this is, if I want to eat beef, I will, and I shouldn't be killed for it. In today's India, are we going to kill people for eating beef? Or for their religion?
Which is why I asked you the question, that do you think that beef politics is going to cost the current government big time?
I think beef politics represents the beginning of losing control on a narrative by a very, very media savvy party. This party came to power because it understood the media. It is quite surprising to me that it has lost its communication skills, have been the opposite of what they were in the campaign. In the campaign of 2014, they were clever. Now they just seem to they seem to not be able to script their own narrative. They've got all kinds of loony people saying all kinds of loony things, and they're not able to rein them in, and some of those people are in government. So how is the media expected to even ignore them?
So who do you think these loony people are who are saying these loony things? Is it the Prime Minister? Is it people around him? Who are these loonies?
No, I think the Prime Minister's been very to not say anything at all inappropriate himself. But the fact of the matter is there are comments that have cost them politically. I believe when the BJP president campaigned in Bihar and said that those who vote, who don't want us to come to power are people, who will celebrate our defeat with firecrackers in Pakistan.
Yes.
You know, I think Bihar hit back with the defeat. And I do not, and you know, I met BJP supporters, Modi supporters in Bihar who were horrified at that comment. And what really disturbs me is that nationalism has become some sort of camouflage today for promoting hatred. You take a position and immediately you're called anti-national. Like, to have an opinion that is independent of a dominant narrative is to be anti-national. I find that really disturbing.
You were also very disappointed when Shah Rukh Khan went back
Yes.
on the interview that he gave you.
Yes.
And he turned around and more or less said, well, I didn't quite mean that. When a lot of people were, congratulating him
Yeah.
for having taken a position.
You know what's so ironic? Shah Rukh, I was interviewing Shah Rukh as he turned 50, and I didn't expect him to be as candid as he was. I actually thought that, he was really in fine form, he was blunt, he was outspoken, and almost in an anticipation of the kind of things that were said to him, he said, listen, and he looked into the camera, he said, listen, if you're going to tell me to go to Pakistan for my comments, I'm not going, this is my country, I'm staying here. And I thought that was wonderful. And when the attacks on him began, and sure enough, there were people who said, why don't you go to Pakistan? I wrote a column in the Hindustan Times saying, Shah Rukh, we don't deserve you. And it was a shame I felt at the narrative. But then I was really disappointed, and I haven't met him since then, to read and hear that he was disowning his comments and blaming them on the media and the people who had interviewed him, and blaming, his film not doing so well on those comments. And, I feel Shah Rukh and others are at a point where they have nothing left to lose. This is a point in their life where they should be able to take risks. They should be able to deal with a few films flopping if that's the cost.
Yes.
And it was really disappointing to me because it's all on tape. Nobody has force-fed those words into Shah Rukh's mouth, and what he said is there for everyone to see. This was not the Shah Rukh I knew. I'm surprised to see a Shah Rukh backtracking.
What kind of a Shah Rukh did you know?
A pretty outspoken Shah Rukh. Shah Rukh, a few years ago, spoke of how it's unfair that Pakistani players are not allowed into the IPL.
But he's a stakeholder, Barkha.
But at least he was the only one who
But he
took
was
that
very
position.
quiet after the Bombay riots, let me tell you, the terror attacks. He said not a word.
And I think that's sad. Shobha, here's the paradox.
He doesn't need to speak for that.
Sorry?
But he needs to speak about the IPL. Anyway, that's fine. We'll come to questions
We'll
later
come
from
to
the
questions.
audience.
My point is something else. My point is, if you look at the West, you see people in the industry from Meryl Streep to George Clooney to Matt Damon taking very, very outspoken positions. Here, we criticize our industry for being cowardly, but when they take positions, we start trolling them, we start building this narrative that they're anti-national. But yes, I would have expected Shah Rukh to have the guts to stand by what he said. Don't you and I get trolled every day? Do we take back our positions? Why has he taken back his position? So what if I haven't seen Dilwale. Some people say it's a bad film, so it flopped. Should he be blaming that on his views?
What do you feel about Amir and what's happened with him and the Incredible India campaign that he was, technically they didn't renew his contract.
Well, Amitabh Kant, I don't know if he's here, we should have
Yes,
asked
he
him
is,
that.
but I'm asking you.
You know what, I actually, before the controversies erupted with both, I actually agreed with Shah Rukh more than I agreed with Amir, in the sense that I thought Shah Rukh's use of words and his assertion that this was his India and nobody was going to oust him from it was something I related to. I did not relate personally to an Amir saying that, Kiran and I are talking about this being
Packing
a country.
our bags.
Because this is our country, why should anyone pack their bags? I didn't relate to that. That said, I believe in freedom of expression even when I completely disagree with that expression. And I see absolutely no reason that actors or you and me or anyone sitting here should be penalized commercially for their views. I don't get that. I just don't get it.
So you see Amir in this context being victimized, or?
No, I think
And you think Amitabh will make a better, Amitabh Bachchan, that is not Mr. Kant, will make a better ambassador for Incredible India?
see, I think
He's also an ambassador for Incredible Gujarat, of course.
what I do think is, when we examine ourselves as a country, we are not speaking against India. And I believe that we should have the maturity to know that you can be a country at argument with herself. We can be people who argue. We can like some things about ourselves. We can dislike. Now, for example, tomorrow, if Amir were to have said that there is racism in India, does that mean that he is anti-India? He's saying something that disturbs him as an Indian. I believe that as proud Indians, we should be able to critique ourselves, and it doesn't take away from our entities as proud Indians. But I don't believe he's victimized. I believe he's a big star. Shah Rukh's a big star. It'll all be forgotten by the next movie.
You've, in the book, about almost by by accident perhaps, you hit upon what turned out to be a huge scoop.
Yes.
The Jindal story, and we have a question which we'll take later, which was on Twitter,
Yeah.
relating to that incident.
Yes.
And you stumbled upon the
Yes.
thing. So do you want to tell us how that happened?
Okay, so
A
this
background to it as well.
So there's an industrialist called Sajjan Jindal, as some of you may have heard, and they own the biggest steel factory in India, among other businesses. And I happened to be at a dinner once of business leaders, and this is how I first stumbled on it, and then I corroborated and cross-checked it. And you know, there was an impression in the media that Nawaz Sharif and Narendra Modi were at loggerheads, and they were not talking at all, and things were terrible, and they had met in Kathmandu, and all of us suckers in the media, clearly not knowing anything, and reported saying, oh, how frosty things are, and look, they've barely shaken hands, and look at India, Pakistan, things are so bad, etc., etc. They met in Nepal. And then I discover that actually when we thought they were not talking at all, they had actually had an undercover, under the radar meeting that was mediated by Sajjan Jindal, who happens to be a close family friend of the Sharif family in Pakistan, and has a good equation with the Prime Minister as well.
Also business partner with the Sharif family.
Yes, so in Pakistan
Very
it became
important.
a big talking point that was it a conflict of interest, because Nawaz Sharif's son runs their steel business, and Sajjan Jindal is also in steel. So in Pakistan the questions were a bit different. They were not just about the secret meeting and why it was kept secret, but also about possible conflicts of interest. In India, there was the moment the book came out, and you know, it hit all the newspapers. For 3 days we had no reaction from the government, and we all called the Hindustan Times, which had front page the story, called them, no comment, no comment, no comment. After 3 days, when the issue became really big in Pakistan, we had a kind of very vague sort of denial from the foreign ministry here, coordinated with the denial that side. So I just went on and I said I stand by my story, because by then I'd cross-checked it with multiple sources. I was not looking at the story as a scandal. I was looking at the story as a detail that I had uncovered as a reporter. It was an interesting detail to me. We've always had covert envoys between India and Pakistan. Some of you may not be old enough to remember Kargil, but at the height of the Kargil war, we had R.K. Mishra, who worked with the Ambani funded Observer Research Foundation, actually going to Pakistan on a secret trip. So this has always been part and parcel of diplomacy. So I was not particularly shocked by it, but it was a legitimate scoop for me, and I put it out there. So when the denials came, and I said I stand by my story, and you know, and I completely stand by it. Fast forward to a month later, when Mr. Modi makes a surprise visit in Lahore and says, I'm going to attend Nawaz Sharif's granddaughter's wedding or a family wedding or
Dropped
whatever.
in, he said.
Dropped in.
Dropping in. He was
And
dropping
like
in.
anybody believes that, right? Like these things take weeks of preparation. And guess who was in Lahore at the same time and tweeting photographs was Sajjan Jindal. And I have never felt more vindicated in my life. So I kind of just said, you know, all right, for all you did, are you going to, okay, once is coincidence, what is the second time?
Yeah.
So that was the story.
Since you brought up Kargil, and I
Yes.
know it's something you have dealt with in the
Yes,
book.
yeah.
It was perhaps a difficult time for you when you were faced with all kinds of accusations, almost like you were responsible for the deaths of our Jawans. By giving away positions. You have clarified in the book, but that somehow still persists. People continue, especially in media, that it was the Kargil where you gave away our position, and during the terror attacks, it was your reportage, though you were a whole bunch of people along with Rajdeep and others who were doing pretty much
the same
similar
thing.
stories, that you gave away the location of a family that was trapped there, and which they almost blamed it at your doorstep. It was because of you that the Pakistani handlers knew exactly who was in which room. You have dealt with it in the book, but maybe briefly you can tell our audience how you felt about that.
Sure. So Kargil, I was still in my mid-20s when I went to cover the war, and I was still relatively young in the industry. I'd only worked for 2-3 years, and unlike now where I understand that this kind of slander will come with the turf of being in the public eye, I was quite shocked when I came back. Now remember, in Kargil, when I went to report the war, there were no mobile phones in Jammu and Kashmir, there were no satellite vans. So we had only satellite phones that we could communicate with. So every journalist present had carried an Iridium satellite phone, because no mobile phones, no live transmission, no broadcast vans. And I was cut off from Delhi. I had no idea what was being said here, what was happening here. I come back after 15 days. to a huge amount of accolades, but also this persistent whisper that your satellite phone gave away some true position. Now the army chief at the time, General VP Malik, called me for tea. And I went and he complimented me and he said it was great coverage. And then he said, you look concerned. Is there something on your mind? And I said, sir, I'm really troubled. Somebody told me that my satellite phone may have given away a true position. He said, absolute rubbish. The army was using exactly the same phones because there's no other way to communicate. Yeah. And we would have told you. You were there and we would have told you this is absolute slander and just ignore it. So from that moment onwards, I said, fine, I have this from the chief. The chief put it in his own memoirs. And till this date, you'll have some internet troller who will write this to you. And I just say, okay, do you know more than the army chief? I mean, I believe the army chief, I don't believe you. But I realized then, Shobha, that these things become weapons to target people with, right? Yeah. You repeat something often enough. On 26/11, briefly, because I know you must be wanting to move on to the next one. 26/11 was different. Kargil is absolute rubbish. 26/11, I believe the entire industry made an inadvertent error in not knowing that the handlers existed. We simply did not know that there were people monitoring this in real time because no terror encounter we'd ever covered before had this dimension. We at NDTV changed this about, I think, 40 hours into the siege. But while I think the industry must take 50% of the blame for this inadvertent error, not just Barkha but the industry, and I always marvel at how I become shorthand for the industry, the government must take the other 50% blame. Do you know the facts from the Information and Broadcasting Ministry telling us to not go live came to our office after the siege was over? What did it take for somebody in the government to call up 5 editors and say, don't transmit this live?
Yes.
So, errors all around, unintentional errors and a learning point.
Yeah. Throughout the book, on many levels, at least as a reader and a dispassionate reader, I sensed a very pro-Congress, pro-Chidambaram tone in the book.
Really?
Yeah, do you think journalists can be 100% objective? Are we not people who have our own preferences? We may like one politician more than another. We may like the political party that appeals to our sensibilities more than another. How can you keep the narrative completely and totally objective? Is it even possible? Desirable?
I think, so there are two different questions there. I actually have been called pro-Congress, but I've also been called pro-Kejriwal. And I've also been called, oh, you people have become chamchas of Modi and you never ask the tough questions again. So as somebody who's been called all three and have managed to piss off both the Gandhis and Mr. Modi in a true fashion of being an equal opportunity offender, I think I wear these labels lightly. I'm used to people imputing political preferences, which I actually don't feel. And I actually feel that the tragedy of our discourse today is that people want to put you in boxes. They want to say so-and-so's pro-BJP, pro-Congress, pro-Kejriwal, pro-Nitish, whatever, or anti-so-and-so. Because nobody is able to accept that you can genuinely be independent enough of mind to actually antagonize everybody when needed and to praise different dimensions of different political parties when needed. And I see myself completely, there may be politicians that I think are intelligent. I think Chidambaram's an intelligent politician. That doesn't mean I've never criticized him. He believed I was very critical of his Naxal policy, for example. I think Arun Jaitley is a very, very intelligent politician, and he's in the BJP, which I'm accused of being overcritical of. So I do think that I don't accept this pro-Congress label, but I understand that people today, viewers, if you do not reconfirm their prejudices, they find you biased. So I actually think the change in India is people now come to TV news wanting a reaffirmation of their own views, and if you don't give it to them, you're biased.
Is Arnab Goswami doing just that? A reaffirmation of what people want to hear? What do you think?
I give full credit to Arnab for his success, but he does not represent a kind of journalism that I would be able to practice, and by that I mean that he is extremely populist. Populist is different from popular, though sometimes they can coincide. I think, for example, he will play to a narrative on Pakistan that has no space for any other dimension. He will take what he thinks the mass of people, the position that the mass of people want to hear. I, however, think that my job as a journalist is to maybe sometimes take the positions that the mass of the people don't feel but may change their mind on. And therefore, I'm perfectly willing to be unpopular if it means being true to what I really think. I think with Arnab, you can't tell what he thinks because he's he's kind of playing to what he thinks will win him the maximum brownie points.
Or TRPs?
Or TRPs.
So the TRP game doesn't actually bother you that much? You're not chasing, you don't want to trend night after night?
No. You know what? I actually think that's the most pernicious thing that's happened to journalism. Like when I come to gatherings like this,
Yes.
I can promise you at least one question is going to be on, you people are TRP hunters. And I always turn around and say, what do you think a TRP is? A TRP is all of you. You are the TRPs.
Yes.
So if you decide that you do not like people say, why do people shout on television? And then I say, well, you know, I don't shout on television. But when I don't shout on television, you don't find it entertaining enough. So then you watch the shouters, then you bitch about them, then you come and ask me to answer for them. Ask them.
So to get back to the book, and Barkha will be taking questions from the audience. There's a Ritu Raj who's asking you, Hazarika. It says, Barkha Dutt, what does the horse signify in your book? There's a horse on the cover. And,
The horse is actually an image chosen by my publishers and not from a story I've reported, but it's from the 92 93 riots in Mumbai and the aftermath and the blasts and the riots. And it's a man who is trying to escape from the violence with the horse from his carousel, the merry-go-round. And we spoke a lot about, you know, why this cover, and I said, you know, it's not even a story I've reported. I was in college then. But the feeling was that it was a symbol. It was a symbol of many things. My book is about the fault lines that stand between India and her future, the fissures, the wounds, and how they may heal. And in this we saw a man, an ordinary Indian, still pursuing his livelihood, his ordinariness as the violence rages on behind him, a violence that he didn't create, a violence that was created around him, that he's seeking to escape. And we thought it conveyed the restiveness and the simmering tensions of India that we don't talk often honestly enough about.
you also said towards the end of the book that India remains a deeply unequal country.
Yes.
And you said it with a lot of anguish, and you've narrated a particular incident.
Yes.
Which is positive, the incident of the marriage between the young girl from two different communities.
Yes.
And what the father's gone through, and eventually there's a happy ending. Your book is called, or you talked about being the land being unquiet. Do you think we're likely to become quieter, or do you think we're likely to become more equal, looking ahead, looking forward?
I think that India is a moment of great churn. I think liberalization, globalization, the fact that we're as diverse and multicultural as we are, the fact that we're still seeking national consensus on basic things. How do we define secularism? Can we agree? How do we define capitalism? Are we capitalist or socialist? Can we agree? How do we define, I don't know, nationalism? We don't even agree on that. Should we be penalizing a couple for not standing up to the anthem in a cinema hall? We don't agree on so many things. I think India's in the midst of a huge national debate, and I see us getting a lot noisier before we get any quieter.
And a final question, do you see Achhe Din ahead?
I believe that there are things that Mr. Modi is doing that confound his critics and his supporters. For example, his Pakistan policy. I'm sure it's stumped BJP supporters more than it has BJP critics. Just to give you an example, it's not playing to script at all. I believe that Modi represents a kind of political reinvention at every stage. If you look at his political life, he began as a hardline Hindutva chief minister in the aftermath of the riots, and he constantly kept reinventing.
You've called it a pogrom.
Yes, I mean, it was
a very strong word.
It was a pogrom. Okay. It was a pogrom. I mean, of course, the Sabarmati Express and what happened in Godhra was hideous, but after that, just like 1984 and 2002 remained bookends for me. The only difference was TV did not exist in 84, so we did not see those images on television in the way that we were able to see in 2002. But I believe that Mr. Modi is not dogmatic. I believe his ambition is personal and not ideological. I think he's seeking a legacy for himself. Therefore, he's going to surprise us. But I do believe that he cannot remain silent, and he should not remain silent. A masterful orator should not remain silent on Hyderabad and Dadri while tweeting about everything else.
So we are happy to start with questions. We'll have to restrict the questions to people in up front because the mics is going to be difficult. Oh, we have mics at the back. Okay, that's great. So shall we start at the back then? There's a person with a hand up right here. And just introduce yourself. Keep your question short, please. Okay. And
where we
there's a lady.
Good evening, ma'am. I'm
Where are you?
Alkendra Singh.
1 minute, where are you?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yes, good evening, ma'am. I'm Alkendra Singh
Good
from
evening.
Jaipur.
Yes, sir.
And right now we are talking about the advertisement Incredible India which Amir was doing.
Yes.
And let us say the technical agreement ends, so the government has offered the plant to advertise to Amitabh Bachchan.
Yes.
I see how makes it difference to the common man whether Amir is doing or Amitabh is doing. You see, you people create the segment in the society. I am not against the media, but these are the only person who are getting benefit out of it. Well, do you think Amitabh Bachchan will get more tourists to India? Do you think Amir will get it less
Hang on. Now you've asked your question, now let me answer. Okay. Now, at one level you're right. Why should you guys, give a toss about who's the Incredible India brand ambassador? Frankly, if you'd asked me 1 month ago, I wouldn't have even remembered who it is. And I'm sure most of you asked offhand would not know. The only reason it becomes a legitimate media debate is we must never believe that people in this country are penalized for their opinions. That is all. That is why it is a legitimate question. We ask the question. There are complexities to it. You could say, for example, that if you represent Pepsi Cola, you can't say I actually like Coke better. But I don't believe that to critique your country is to not represent it proudly. I believe India is an unequal country for women. That doesn't mean I'm not a proud Indian. So why are you all so nervous about the media asking these questions? You're free to disagree, but allow us to have the conversation.
Hello, ma'am.
Hi.
Good evening.
Who's got the mic? No, this young lady, please. She's behind. And we'll take the question from
Hi,
you.
Hi.
Nishtha.
Hi, Nita.
Right. So, the title is very interesting, the fault lines.
Yes.
Fault lines are, as a storyteller, you as a journalist, fault lines really mean good stories, chasing stories. They make for good stories.
Yeah, sure.
As a journalist and a storyteller, do you feel that you inadvertently you end up nurturing the fault lines rather than filling them and sort of making a level there,
It's a very interesting question, and I sometimes do think that. So, for example, one of the positions I have on my show, Nishtha, is that there are certain people I don't allow. I don't allow them to come as guests because I believe that a lot of channels deliberately pit one rabble-rouser against another rabble-rouser. Sometimes they deliberately pick people of different faiths. It's, Noam Chomsky used to have a phrase called manufactured consent, but I believe television today has become about manufactured dissent. And I do believe it is important for the media to actually sometimes play a bridge, and to not create an extremist confrontation for the heck of it, because it's more entertaining or because more people will shout. That said, I think it is a journalist's job to sometimes chase the bad news. Unfortunately, what is good or what is routine or what is mundane, maybe even you wouldn't want to watch. You may want to watch a hopeful story. So, for example, I had a young man on my show the other day who's a youngest single father who adopted a child with Down syndrome. Now, that's a story of hope. But if people are getting along amicably and they're exchanging sweets on Diwali and Eid, yes, we do give space to those voices, but it's the rupture that we're more concerned about as journalists than the ordinariness of normal life. And I think that's true for media all over the world. So I think there's a lot of lazy media bashing that also goes on.
Young man.
Good evening,
here.
ma'am. My name is Darshil. My question is regarding the concept of trial by media. Like often, so many cases get reported in media, like the Sheena Bora case, for example, that by the time the actual judicial process sets in, there's already a preconceived notion in the minds of people. So what's your take on that?
I think it's a big flaw with our industry. I mean, there is, media activism started off in cases like the Jessica Lal case, like in exposing corruption. But we've reached a point where we are trying to replace courtrooms. We have reached a point where we are actually tarnishing entire lives with what I call Maggie noodle justice. It's 2-minute verdicts, right? I am disturbed by it. I'm disturbed by this trend in my industry. I think we need to pause and think these are real people. These are real families that we might be destroying. So we must be very sure. We must be very sure before we report something.
We'll take a question from, yeah, you got the mic?
I got the mic.
He's got,
But that's for my question. Sorry.
that's not nice.
But I'll hand
That's
it over
not
to
fair.
you thereafter. Good evening, ma'am. My
Hi.
name is Dheeraj Shekhar. Big fan of yours.
Thank you.
And congratulations for the book launch.
Thank you.
And thanks for standing up for the country at the Women's of World Conference.
Thank you.
That meant something. My question is on the business of journalism.
Yes.
Apologies to the organizer, but we are at Z-sponsored event. And Dr. Prannoy Roy also referred to that in his speech at the Red Ink Lifetime Achievement Awards, wherein he pointed that we are becoming a tabloidization of news and no onus of owning whatever wrong or incorrect opinions
Yeah.
TV anchors might say.
What's your question, sir?
Question is, if a Sudhir Chaudhary goes on TV screen, asks 100 crores for a news to be not broadcasted, but still come back in Z News, what as an audience we have the rights to go about it, or for that matter, the journalism community in itself? Because if a politician were to do that, you'll all be in one voice asking him to resign at the same moment. But I don't see the same voice against Sudhir Chaudhary. Why is that not the case really?
No, I would say that your concern about the state of media is something one hears a lot. Even in the industry, we have these ongoing conversations. But, it's not about one individual or the other. I mean, Sudhir has answered this for himself, and I don't want to talk about individuals, but I will talk about the industry. And about the industry, I would say that the phrase you used in the beginning, the business of journalism, is where the problem maybe begins, because television is an expensive medium, and the revenue models tend to mean that the only way the television journalism can survive is either if the state foots the bill or if corporate houses foot the bill. We have not found a revenue model where people are willing to pay for subscription, for example. Simultaneous to that, you have an age of hyper-information where anyone with a mobile phone and an opinion today is a journalist. So you do find that there is a kind of greater tendency to tabloidization, because I think what television did to print, pushing it to reinvent, social media has done to television today, and television is scrambling to remain relevant, and therefore some people have chosen to remain relevant by going down the tabloid route, by seeking to win popularity charts, by playing to the lowest common denominator, and therefore I think we're seeing television also trying to find its relevance and trying to look for a way to reinvent itself.
Just to a follow-up to that, there is a sort of a cozy relationship between corporates and media houses these days. And how comfortable or uncomfortable does that make you? Corporate houses controlling media, for example, they own media.
I mean, in an ideal world, of course, I would like it to be otherwise. But then when I think about what the otherwise is, I can't come up with a third model of media ownership. So, if you look at Al Jazeera, for example, it's owned by the Kingdom of Qatar. And therefore, there are certain, while everybody sort of admires it for its sort of alternative view of the Middle East or the Arab world, the fact is that it comes from a certain position which the Kingdom of Qatar has. Similarly, you have the General Electric owning NBC in the United States of America. The much respected BBC is still subsidized because the state chooses to retain a license-free policy. So I would dearly love that all of us could together have a community-owned television station, but I'm betting when it comes to paying up, nobody does, because information is cheap today, information is free, it's the age of the internet. So I'm not very comfortable with the amount of corporate money there is in the media, and I think the best we can hope for, given its inevitability, is complete disclosure. So you have to be able to disclose to your viewers
Absolutely.
and have disclaimers at the end of any story that may be a potential conflict of interest.
Now we have only 10 minutes, so we're going to take quick questions. So if you could just please keep the question brief. Thank you.
Just hold it closer.
I read your book and that one line stood up to me that
Hold it close.
I'm Nimrat, and one line really stood out from your book. You said that no amount of feminism can protect me from the guilt and the self-loathing that I face. How have you dealt with it, and do you still, to get the courage to keep on going, because things don't stop as a woman? So how do you deal with that?
So what I did write was that when I experienced child sexual abuse, of course I was too young to know how to deal with it. But when I was older and dealt with violence in a relationship while I was doing my MA, I went around the entire university campus trying to get the faculty to take action against this guy. I went to meet lawyers and I said I want to take this to court because I was the kind of woman who would always fight. I met other women who'd been hit by him and I said, will you come forward? Nobody was willing to come forward. The lawyers told me, you will spend the next 20 years in court trying to get this, because it's a he said, she said thing, you will never be able to prove it, leave it. And it was my first encounter with how difficult it is. And however liberal, progressive, and I am an unabashed feminist, and I was even then. And yet I found that you end up blaming yourself. You look for ways to punish yourself, and I think that this is a conversation that many women have with themselves, and all we can do is to constantly tell ourselves that it isn't my shame, it's his.
Hi, Barkha.
Where are you?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi.
My name is Aparna.
Just hold it closer.
Yeah, I'm Aparna. We were discussing about perceptions and gender bias in the media industry, and
Yeah.
I'm asking this question as somebody who's worked in a news channel for 5 years.
Yeah.
How do you think this perception will break when there's such less representation of women in the senior roles in the media industry? And is this fact a testimony to the point that women are not rising to the senior roles, and then that's how it happens?
So it's a very interesting question, because if you look at television, you would think women are everywhere, right? And in many ways we are. But you're absolutely right that, we were the only channel where there was a woman editor. And if you look at the newspapers, we have Shobna Bhartia who owns the Hindustan Times. But other than that, if you look at the mass of newspapers, you look at the mass of channels, you look at the mass of digital media, where is female ownership? Where are the women editors? And therefore, this glass ceiling that we think we've smashed, we have a long way to go. The ceiling is cracked, it's not smashed.
Just to interject here quickly,
Yeah.
in the context of what she just asked you, there's a wonderful incident with Hillary Clinton.
Yes.
Where you discuss exactly this. If you could share that with the audience. It's a fantastic incident. The hairstyle.
Yes. So I was talking to Hillary Clinton about, the strangeness of America being so reluctant to vote in a woman president. And she was telling me about what she experiences as a woman in the public eye. And she said, Barkha, whenever they write about me, they'll always say Hillary Clinton, bracket, wearing a blue pantsuit and having a bad hair day, bracket closed, and then the rest of the sentence, what she's saying on Iraq or Syria, And she said, they never say that about Obama. When was the last time you said Obama wearing a terrible beige suit, or, you never hear that. And she said, Barkha, I understood that day that to be a woman in public life, you need to have a skin as thick as the hide of a rhinoceros. And I think that's what I've developed, and I think it keeps me in good stead. But you know what, as you're asking your question, Shobha, since I just love being on that side and not this side, why don't you tell us about your encounter with Mr. Modi and how you've dealt with all the criticism that you've made of him and what backlash you've had to face. We can't let her go without answering that, right? Yeah.
No, it was really a very unexpected but very funny incident. The first time when we were introduced, and the person introducing us said, "Aap inko pehchante hain?" So Mr. Modi looked me in the eye and he said, sarcastically, and he's quite dramatic. He's really a theatre actor.
Yes.
So with the 56-inch chest had by then become 66, and he said, "Inhe kaun nahi pehchanta?" Then he stopped. Then comes the punchline. सालों से इनकी गालियां खा रहा हूँ
Hello. Hi, Barkha, yeah.
One more question.
Yeah, 1 second.
1 second, where are you guys?
Yeah, hello.
Yeah, okay.
So I will ask a question and then give it to this old lady who has been standing
Yes,
for a lot
please.
of time, right?
Give it to her first.
Give it to her. Then.
Give it
Let's
to her.
stop it because I'll not get it back.
No, you're being very selfish.
Give it to her
first, and she'll
I
give it
think I
back to
raised
you.
the point. It was me who observed her.
Okay.
Well,
I'm
all
not
right.
being selfish, right?
Okay,
so,
okay.
I just had a very small point to make.
Yes.
Why do journalists today, and this is bad, have an opinion? I
Wha-
don't.
Why do
journalists?
Journalists?
Why do they force their opinion on the viewers? You have a very all the journalists today have this very biased opinion, and you push it
That's
on the
That's
viewers.
our job.
It's not only enough; it is all.
Because you no longer watch the 9 p.m. news to know the news because your smartphone has told you the news. You come to us to see what we think and then you decide what you think, or maybe you tell us on Twitter what you think and you mold our opinion and we mold yours, and it's a two-way street.
Ma'am, listen.
Okay,
Now please, now
the lady please,
Ma'am,
the lady
ma'am.
at the back. Thank you.
I'm I'm Manindra.
Hi ma'am.
My question is, you must be facing a number of dilemmas
Yes.
in reporting.
Yes.
Whether it's on women's issues, women's rape, crime, other crime, or political issues.
Sure.
How do you resolve them?
So let me give you such a good question, and let me give you an example of a story I did recently that divided viewer response in equal measure between love and hate. And one of the things you discover as a journalist is the same story can evoke deep admiration and deep hatred. So I went to Pathankot to report on the terror strike. And as I was traveling through the villages of Punjab, somebody told me that one of the martyrs' funeral was happening in a village. I traveled 5 hours to get to that village, and I went to meet the family of this martyr. It turned out that his wife and daughter had been at the airbase when the airbase was attacked, and therefore not just were they victims, they were also eyewitnesses to this strike, and we had no eyewitness, we had no eyewitness accounts till now. I then discovered in my conversation, I was sitting with the women of the house without a camera, just talking to them. I then asked them, would you like to speak about your husband or your father? So the daughter, who's 25 years old, and an English teacher, and her father was, a subedar, he was not educated, but he educated his daughter, the English teacher called Madhu. She said, I would like to speak. I said, okay. I said, are you sure you like to speak? She said, yes. So I said, I'm getting my camera, and she spoke. Now, while she was speaking, she had moments of choking up, as is natural. Her father had just, been killed by these terrorists, been martyred by these terrorists. As she was speaking, she said, come with me to the cremation ground. The coffin was being brought there. And do you know that all the women of the village, because women traditionally don't go to the cremation ground, stood at a 1 kilometer distance, and I saw Madhu carrying the coffin of her father on her shoulders, and I thought it was an extraordinary image, so I did a whole story on it. Later, when I went on to Twitter, I had about 50% of my viewers saying, extraordinary story, we love you, this is the most moving thing we've seen on television, she was extraordinary. And 50% of viewers saying, why did you interview her when she was upset? And, it speaks to the dilemma you speak about. And I said, because I will not take away the agency of people to make a choice, because it makes my viewer uncomfortable to see grief. Because if we are going to shut down our cameras every time somebody cries, then tomorrow we may never interview the family of a soldier who's been killed. We may never interview the mother of a child who's terminally ill. We may never interview a woman who's talking about sexual experience. Why should tears and grief scare us? Why should we become like the Americans who, when George Bush invaded Iraq, the media was stopped from showing coffins on a government diktat, and the media followed it, and I thought that completely took away from the cost of war. So let us never forget the cost of war. But was it a dilemma, ma'am? It was a dilemma. Sometimes I choose incorrectly, sometimes I choose correctly, sometimes I don't know the difference. But I have to take split-second decisions every day of my life, and it's never easy.
Thank you.
That was a simple question. Last one.
There's one, and then there's one person who's waiting there patiently
I think there's
after
one on the
you.
side.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
It's not about the media community, it's about to you. The worker who has done Kargil so successfully, but in 2611, you were waiting for the IB call to not do live transmission. Was it not the TRP game even in that condition as like you were waiting, you were talking about to the Arnab Goswami also?
The fact that you've had to write your
excuse me.
question means how insincere is the question.
No,
The
it's not
reading of your
insincere.
question.
It's not
I just
insincere.
answered this. I
Right,
answered this.
I'm just waiting for the answer that time, where was that worker and the nationalistic approach? Is that only an error unintentionally? So only error unintentionally.
I can't-
and we also want to listen on your take on Malda issues also. Thank you. After Dadri and after Hyderabad, because it's not in the talk till now. Thank you.
Firstly,
Just
I would
Mr.
answer
Malda.
Malda, but I cannot dignify somebody who actually thinks that anybody would deliberately
Capitalize.
jeopardize an ongoing operation. I don't think your question deserves an answer on that front. On Malda, I do believe that it was covered. I do believe that the channel I work for, I happen to be off on leave at that time, so my show did not cover it, but a colleague's show covered it. We discussed it in the newsroom. It was on prime time. And the strange equivalence that we need to draw every time, that to grieve for a Muslim, you must also grieve for a Hindu, and if you didn't, why are you grieving for the Muslim? Really? Is this the country we've become? We can't just grieve for a human life without it being politicized, where the right wing will come after you every time you stand up for the minorities? Since when did standing up for India's minorities, which I think is the duty of the majority, become a crime?
Last question, please. Last question. We are very out of time. Thank you.
I'm on the other side. Like you have to see through the screen.
Barka is there.
Yeah.
Oh, there. Can you just come
yeah,
down?
yeah.
Please, thank you.
You have covered, I don't think anybody has covered Kashmir like you have. I've been on your program a couple of
Yes.
times also. But you were talking about minorities, and it is absolutely the duty of the majority to protect the minorities.
Yes.
But
The
when it
pundits.
comes to Kashmir,
The pundits.
yeah, why do you think that the only Muslim majority state in this country, from where 5 lakh Kashmiri Pandits were ethnically cleansed, it does not make such a good story for you?
So, you know what's, I agree, to start with, I agree with you. And because you agree with me that the majority must protect the minority, that is as true for Jammu and Kashmir, where the Muslims should have protected the Pandits and did not, and failed to do so along with the state. Absolutely true. I do a program on this every year. 2 days ago was the Exodus, the day that marks 26 years of the Pandits in exile. And in fact, I did a big show, and I was shocked to sort of see that, you know, there were even suggestions that the onus is on Pandits to return. This is what Farooq Abdullah
That's
said
right.
to me.
Shocking statement.
It was a shocking statement, and I got into a raging argument with him. I've known him for many years, but I got into a raging argument with him saying, you can't possibly put the onus on Pandits to return in a society where they don't feel secure or welcome. Do I believe it to be one of the forgotten narratives of our time? I do. I think that it is a shame, and I actually think Kashmiriyat, or the idea of Kashmiriyat, is incomplete and meaningless without the homecoming for Pandits. So I accept your point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
You've been
guys.
a fantastic
Thank
audience.
you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.